like I'll tell you, Jim, and you probably know this because you've known Kevin for a while. We recorded the right stuff with Kevin, maybe a month, 2 months ago, something like that. I
Yeah, it was
can't
like May,
recall.
I think.
Yeah, how like that's an entire season ago. Um, and the whole time I was thinking, it's like Kevin is magic on the mic. I had to like, and this is not like there's no shortage of space movies. It turns out. So I was like, I want like anytime I could get Kevin back on, and then we started talking, and he was telling me that he knew you, and I was like, okay, let's do this. So yeah, I'm excited. So
Happy to do it. I actually went back to the annotated screenplay that we published that Singer and I did together, the conversation back and forth, and with pages of, which has gotten some really nice reviews. A lot of film buffs suggest that more movies should have their screenplays annotated like this. But to refresh my memory of things, I went back and read through most of that again this afternoon. And it's been a while. It's probably been the longest interval since I've seen the movie, because I've probably seen the movie now a dozen times, but I haven't seen it now. Probably, I know it's just come on Netflix, without having to pay for it, unless you have to pay for Netflix, of course. But I haven't seen the movie for maybe 9 months or something. So,
all right. Well, hopefully you won't forget what's in it. So
no, I don't think I will. I just not clever forget. No.
All right, you guys. Well, let's we get ready to rock. You guys ready to go?
Sure.
Let's go.
All right. You know what? Let's say, are we lifting off, blasting off? I don't know what we're doing. Like, I used to do like the hard. Like when I first started doing the podcast, I would do like the hard open, like "Welcome back to Story." Like now, I'm just like, "Hey, hi guys," and we'll edit everything in. So, Jim, welcome to the pod. It's our very first time having you, and Kevin, welcome back. Why don't you ever leave us? So.
It's like the proverbial bad penny always turning up, right?
You know what? I'm liking this because I know what the listeners don't, which is that you're coming back shortly. We've already recorded your second podcast with doing Space Camp, which you guys haven't been listening to thus far. Is Kevin saying that I was grilling him hard during that film? That's nonsense, sir. I just happened to have watched that movie 150. I made Space Camp notes actually while watching First Man, guys, the other day when they're talking about the multi-axis trainer. It's in both films.
That's right.
So I was very excited. But before we jump into this movie, before we jump into this book, you guys want to introduce yourselves? Jim, you want to go first? You want to introduce yourself and what you're doing here?
Well, I'm a retired Auburn history professor. I taught at Auburn University for 32 years, specializing in the history of science and technology, but mostly writing about the history of air and space. When I finished my PhD at Ohio State back in 1981, a long time ago now, I got a postdoc with NASA to do a book for them, and that turned into a second book for them. So it kind of introduced me. I had to sort of retool in a way. I had not done anything really to do with the history of flight prior to NASA getting a hold of me, asking me if I was interested in doing the book for them. But the retooling into air and space subjects became almost a permanent mainstay of my career. Even when I took the job at Auburn in 1986, I continued to do things with NASA for at least, and the Smithsonian for a number of years. And then I guess the turning point in the career came about mid-career for me. I'd been department head for 4 years, and so I'd been moving up the ladder and became a full professor. And at that point in the late 1990s, I decided I was going to sort of stick my neck out and give it a shot to try to do Neil Armstrong's biography. I was teaching a graduate seminar in space history. And, I always started the seminar with going around the room and having students tell me what they're interested in, because, they're going to have to do a seminar paper in that particular So when we were going around the room, then they asked me, well, what are you doing? And I thought, well, I just finished a book, and I thought, well, what I really like to do is a biography of an astronaut. And I said, but the one that I would really like to do is Neil Armstrong, but nobody's ever been able to successfully get his support in any kind of way. And so I wrote him a letter, got an address, which wasn't it wasn't easy to do just to get a mailing address for him, but through a contact at NASA headquarters, I was able to do that. Wrote him a letter, and about a month later, I got a very nice letter back from him, which was a polite thanks, but no thanks. He told me he had had any number of authors, approach him, but he was still kind of busy. He hadn't totally retired from his corporate. He was on a number of corporation boards and active that way. And so he just said, thank you and nice to meet you. And then I thought, okay, I went back to my students and reported, and they said, you can't take no for an answer. You've got to do something. I thought, well, his birthday was coming up, and I thought, well, I'll send him a couple of my books that I thought he could be interested in. And just if nothing comes from him, I know that Neil Armstrong's got a couple of my books. Maybe he'll open one up. And it took about 3 months then. And then I got a letter back from him thanking me for the books. And he had read one of them cover to cover, he said, and another one he had started. And I'd have to go back through my correspondence to remember exactly how it happened. You'd think I'd remember. But basically, it opened up a little bit of a conversation. It certainly wasn't a decisive thing because it took about 2 years from the time I first approached him to getting finally his willingness to participate with me. But it involved meeting him. I got an invitation to come up. He lived in a suburb of Cincinnati, and I came up and I spent the afternoon with him. We sat in his studio for about 3-4 hours. His second wife, Carol, would come in from time to time and listen in. And that conversation, I can go into great detail, which I won't bother you with, but there were some key moments in our conversation where, I accidentally said some things that were apparently the right things to say and the right names to drop. And at the end of it, I felt very positive that things could develop to the point of I could write the book. But Neil being Neil, it still took, a number of emails and letters and he finally agreed, and he wanted to know exactly what I wanted from it. He knew what he wasn't going to write the book. I never, that wasn't part of what I wanted to do. I wanted to write his biography, be the sole author. I just wanted to have access. I wanted interview time. I wanted to get into his papers. I wanted permission, I wanted him to know that I wanted to talk to as many different people, fellow astronauts, friends from boyhood, family members, and everything. And I felt I would probably need his support. I think, in fact, my contract with him, my agreement with him, asked for a to whom it may concern letter, where he would basically say, I'm helping Jim, I would encourage you to help him too in whatever way. And that was really important because if you knew Neil, and as someone like, let's say, Jim Lovell or Dave Scott, one of the other Apollo astronauts, they knew Neil was so private that if you just approached them and say, I want to talk to you about Neil Armstrong, they'd go, well, but you almost need to have Neil say, yeah, go ahead, talk to Jim. So I got that from him. I also agreed, and even though he did not bring this up, and this is, again, so many things that are classic Neil Armstrong that you wouldn't have other astronauts agree to or do, but he never asked for any cut of the book or any at all, but I thought it'd be a good idea to do it. And so I offered to either cut, give him a certain percentage of the royalty money or donate to a charity of his choice. And I actually suggested that maybe he I knew that he had a strong connection with Purdue University, where he went to school, graduated in the mid-50s in aeronautical engineering. And I thought, from what I knew about it, that he might support that. So we agreed to give a certain amount of money from the book and later from the movie to Purdue, where his papers now rest. So anyway, it was a long story. I made it as short as I can possibly make it. And that I got his access. I ended up with 55 hours of tape recorded interview with him over several months, and got access to his papers. And I interviewed over 125 people, almost all the surviving astronauts that were from his era. And it was a remarkable time for me. I knew how lucky I was that I was getting this opportunity. My university, Auburn, gave me 2 years leave to write the book, and they supported me generously during that time because they knew that this was it made news when the book was announced that this academic historian had Neil Armstrong's participation. We got pretty major stories about that already. And that leads to a discussion of the film because one of we got a call from Mal Paso Studios in California, which is Clint Eastwood's production company, and Clint wanted to meet Neil and wanted to meet me because he was interested in doing a film, getting the rights to the book. I hadn't really started the book. I mean, I wrote the book in about 2 years. It took me 2 years to get Neil's approval, and it took me about 2 years to write a very large book. But I had, in my career up to that point, through the stuff I had done with NASA, the other books, I had written almost a lot. I'd written about Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, the X-15, everything that he was in his life. I just had to plug him into the overall story. So anyway, Eastwood invited us out. The book had barely gotten started. We went out to California. He has his own golf course, a private golf club near Malibu, not Malibu, on the Monterey Peninsula near Pebble Beach, called Tehama. And we stayed overnight in Tehama. Neil and his wife Carol, myself and my wife Peggy, and we played a round of golf together. I'm a very avid golfer, and so is Neil, and so is Clint. And so as a result of that, that went pretty well. And Clint had Warner Brothers, Mal Paso, and then Warner Brothers to buy the rights, to purchase the rights to the book, which hadn't gotten a good start yet. So originally it was going to be a movie made by Eastwood, and again, as movie stories go, they can last for decades. And something happened. All I ever heard about Eastwood was that he thought that the Armstrong movie would be too much heavy lifting. Mal Paso told me that. And of course, I didn't quite understand. I understood what that meant, but I didn't understand how he could say that to us and then go on and make those two movies that he made about the Battle of Iwo Jima. He made two films. To me, he sounded like, and look, I watched both movies. That's pretty heavy lifting too. So, but for whatever reason, it didn't work out, and which meant that the book, which was published in 2005, got published while it was still under contract and the rights were still held by Warner Brothers. It was a production company called Temple Hill had been involved even at that level, at the earlier level, and they brought it to Universal, and Universal took it to Damien Chazelle, the director Damien Chazelle, who was just beginning. Was working on La La Land with Ryan Gosling, and Damien started talking with Gosling about playing Neil Armstrong before La La Land was even shot. And so it waited until La La Land got done, and then it took off. It took a while because the movie didn't come out until 2018, so there was a lot of waiting time, and so that's the basic story of how my book became the movie. And of course, I'll stop there about my own career. But once I had the First Man book out, which I'm glad to say did become a New York Times bestseller prior to becoming a movie, has been translated now into over 22 languages, which is thrilling, although I can only read a couple of them. But I moved on to other things too. I mean, I did a book on the Challenger accident. I did a book on the golf course. Golf architecture has always been kind of an avocation for me, and I wrote a book about Robert Trent Jones, the golf architect. I helped astronaut John Young, write his autobiography, so I was helping him with that. So I moved on to other things, but First Man, I suppose, is going to continue to be. It's kind of hard to beat doing a book on Neil Armstrong when no one else, So it is considered an authorized biography, but not really authorized in the sense that sometimes, it sometimes suggests that the subject of the biography had a lot of control over what the subject matter was and how it was said. And I can say, which really speaks well of Neil. Once Neil agreed to help me do the book, he just answered my questions and gave me access to. He wasn't controlling the content. We went over the manuscript together because I wanted him to, I wanted to hear everything he had to say about it. And I promised him I would take everything into consideration, but Neil never tried even to twist my arm or tell me I needed to say this instead of that. Never did any of that. And I can tell you, I think there are a lot of astronauts who would have not done it that way, and I think haven't done it that way. So that's not in quite a nutshell, a big nutshell. That's kind of my career. And I retired from Auburn in 2018, the same year of the movie. I was able to be on set for the movie all the time. And I still am writing, even though I am retired. And I don't think Neil. I did two other books about Armstrong, by the way. Purdue University Press. Purdue is his alma mater. There were lots of letters that were written to Neil in the wake of Apollo 11 that were remarkable letters. I mean, from hundreds and thousands of people from all over the world that Neil kept and responded to in one way or another to most all of them, sometimes with standardized letters, but sometimes personal. And so I wrote two books called Dear Neil Armstrong and another one called The Reluctant Icon, which is a collection, my sampling of letters, which I divided into different themes. Like one chapter in one of the books is all the crazy people that think that the moon landing didn't happen, and how they expressed themselves and what Neil had to say to them. So those are I have kind of a trilogy of Neil Armstrong books now, with the main biography and then the two books that are letters to Neil Armstrong.
The amazing thing here, Jim, is that you're talking about how difficult it was, to maybe get in front of Neil Armstrong, and maybe Kevin can kind of chime in here because, we see a lot of pop culture. We've seen the astronauts, these guys. We'll talk about the celebrity factor of a lot of these astronauts, certainly in that time. And Armstrong, somewhat amazingly, has never felt like a person we could get close to, maybe in the ways that maybe some of the other astronauts who maybe were less shy, or or maybe even sought the spotlight more. Kevin, what are your thoughts? I mean, this idea, it's kind of surprising that it took until 2018 that we get a film devoted to Armstrong. Am I right? Or is he elsewhere in pop culture? Do we see him very often?
Jim could probably say specifically where he might have popped up in pop culture, but ever since I've been involved with aerospace history, Neil was who he was. He had that personality that was very different than most of the astronauts. Certainly much different than what you'd see in like the movie The Right Stuff that we talked about a couple of months ago. That wasn't his personality at all, so I wouldn't say it was probably a conscious decision. That was just sort of innate to his personality, that he wasn't going to engage in that sort of thing in the same way that like a Wally Schirra might have, or go out and write his own book early on, like Buzz Aldrin did. That just wasn't his personality. He was a different type. He was very private. And so it was kind of taken for granted for those of us who would study the space program. I got into it in the 1990s, so somewhat later than Jim, at least in the in an academic sense. But everybody understood that that's how Neil operated, and so trying to get him to cooperate with something or to participate in the same way or to expect that same amount of information about him that you saw with the other astronauts was you just assume that it wasn't there and it wasn't going to be there. And I can speak to that directly from my experience. As I've told you before, back around the time Jim was starting to correspond with Neil, I was working at the NASA Johnson Space Center History Office with their oral history project. And after some number of years, we got Neil Armstrong to agree to do an interview with us. And that ended up lasting the better part of a day. And some of that discussion is probably better held offline. But in a really bizarre quirk, the week that he was scheduled to come do an interview with us, 9/11 happened. Literally, he was supposed to come several days later, and so that through years worth of planning to get him to come in and sit and do this interview was disrupted by that. Of course, that in the grand scheme of things, that's a very very minor thing, but it was just this sort of. My point is, it was just a little bit of um, odd hurdle that you wouldn't expect, but trying to get this interview with him. But then he had committed to it, so he was willing to see that through, and he had his. Kind of ideas for what that should be in his structure. I mean, he was very clear with us. He didn't want to go do a public affairs style interview. He wanted to actually dive into some topics of, in a technical sense, to be different than the typical astronaut sort of interview. And, the process was a little bit atypical for us, but we ended up doing that interview, and they brought in now who's a relatively well-known historian, Douglas Brinkley, to do that. Again, that's kind of a long story by itself, but at the time he didn't have quite the name that he did now, and so he and uh, Shoot, his name's escaping me. The author of Band of Brothers.
Stephen
Uh,
Stephen Ambrose.
Yes,
Ambrose.
Stephen
Stephen
Ambrose, right. He was supposed to be the primary interviewer, and he brought Douglas Brinkley with him. And so the two of them basically did the interview with Brinkley, kind of doing the heavy lifting, to borrow Jim's term. I was lucky enough that being the Ohio kid, they threw me in the room to run the tape recorder, so I got to sit there with Neil all day long. But the fun part about that for me was when the tape was off during the many cigarette breaks that and Stephen Ambrose took, I got to sit there and just talk with Neil Armstrong about, about Ohio. He knew where I was from, just up the road from where he was living at the time, and so it was just that kind of small talk, and talk about airplanes a little bit, that kind of thing. And so it was very very personable in a one-on-one, tape recorders off sort of situation. So he didn't have that, at least face to face, he didn't have that kind of aloof persona that I think he's been pinned with, just because he was a private individual. So I guess that's a long answer to a relatively short question. I'm sure, Jim obviously knew Neil far, far better than I did, and, probably has much more valuable insight there.
Well, one thing I could say, I knew about the Ambrose Brinkley interview early on, and of course I got a transcript of it, probably from NASA, maybe from you, and
Yeah.
paid a lot of attention to it. But I was so fortunate because if you're lucky enough, if you were lucky enough, and very few were, to have private time with Neil, say he gave you 2 hours. I don't know how much time. I assume he gave you two, maybe three maximum hours for that interview. You can't stray from the main subjects very far. I mean,
Right.
whereas I probably talked to him 30 hours before I ever mentioned the moon landing. 30 hours. It was all about his boyhood, his family, his college career at Purdue, his Navy career at 78 combat missions and during the Korean conflict, his becoming a test pilot out at Edwards for the NACA that became NASA, the X-15 flights. I mean, no one had been that lucky. I mean, nobody. If you got Neil, you had to. I mean, who was not going to talk about the moon landing? I mean,
Right.
that interview by Ambrose and Brinkley got into a few other things, but not too many other things, because you just can't. You're not going to neglect talking about the Apollo program if you got Neil Armstrong there. So I was really so lucky that he gave me so much time, and I would give him questions in advance to think about, because he wanted them, I think, and but then he was okay with me going off script and asking him other things. But I wanted to have, because what he actually researched a number of the questions. He had papers that were. He had some of his papers in his house down in the basement, and he had a bunch of his papers in an office building in downtown Lebanon, Ohio, which was near where he was living on the farm with his family. And and so he would sometimes, based on the questions I sent him, he would go back into those boxes of things, and he would pull out different folders. And then when I was talking to him, if he would rely on going back and refreshing his memory, because he seemed very um, concerned that doing oral history was problematic, especially for him, because he said his memory wasn't that good. Well, it depended on what you're asking about. I mean, if you're asking, you could ask him about orbital mechanics, and he'd give you, a 2-hour lecture. But if you asked him what he thought of Buzz Aldrin, he might have one or two sentences to share with you. So he could have selective memory, I think. But so I knew how lucky I was, and I would usually stay in the Cincinnati area with him for 3 or 4 days at a time, and then I'd go off and do my other interviews or other research. I had National Archives, lots of different places, and then I would, get back with him 3 or 4 months after that. And so that happened. That took place over about a year and a half or so. But I think I have thought from time to time, what if in writing a biography of someone who's still living is very different than writing a biography of someone who's deceased. I think I pulled some punches. I tried to get him to talk about just about everything, but if I knew if it didn't seem he wanted to talk about something, there was a limit to how far I would push him. You know,
Sure.
and things like about the death of his baby daughter Karen, which is a mainstay of the movie. He did open up a little bit, but it was clear to me that I was not going to have too much luck pushing him beyond the little bit that he gave me. So I had to try to triangulate. If he wouldn't talk to me about Karen's death, I would talk to his sister June. One thing I found out, guys, you should know that if you don't want your biography really in depth, don't let the biographer talk to your sister, because your sister can tell stories on you that you might not want. So I talked to his sister, I talked to his brother, I talked to his first wife. I mean, he was married with Janet for 36 years or something, before they divorced. And one of the toucher moments, actually, which was crucial to the movie, because I think Claire Foy's role as Janet in First Man is like a critical role, and I think Claire nailed it. I mean, as an actress, she did such a great job playing Janet Armstrong. Well, a lot of that was based on the fact that I had 16 hours of interview with Janet, and now they're divorced. When I approached Janet Armstrong, they've already been divorced a few years. She's got a house in Park City, Utah, which had been their vacation home when they went skiing, and she got that in the settlement. And so, but before I approached Janet, which I think was a critical approach for the book and the movie, I asked Neil. I said, Neil, I really think I need to talk to Janet. Would that bother you? And I wouldn't have to ask that if he wasn't still living, and I wasn't concerned about my relationship with him. And he said, well, let me think about it. I want to talk to Carol about it. He wanted to talk to his current wife to see what she thought about it. Well, I left. I went back to do my other work, and came back to him again during a set of interviews. And I didn't even bring it up with him. I thought, well, I'll just wait till he. And at the end of one day, he said, "Oh, by the way, Jim, I've talked to Carol, and if you think you need to talk to Janet, then feel free to go ahead." But it was clear to me. I didn't follow up. I just thanked him and said, "I'll do my best." And I didn't ask him for any information about how to contact her, because at that point I didn't have an address, phone number, an email, or anything. I had to come up with that some other way. And then I also, I won't divulge this, but Janet employed a lawyer from California to negotiate from her point of view, why should she bare her soul and share all of her memories with her ex-husband's biographer? What's in it for her? And she wasn't a what's in it for me kind of person, but there had to be some accommodation for that. And I got 16 hours of tape recorded interview. It was amazing interview time with her. It was not just Look magazine talking to her like they did back in the 60s with Life magazine, I guess it is, with the big contract that they had. She could be herself. She could tell the real story. There were times that I had to turn the recorder off because she wanted it off the record. But even though it was off the record and unrecorded, I still had heard it, and there were ways I could assimilate the meaning of it and use it in other powerful ways. And so a lot of that depiction of the family life in First Man and Janet's character. In fact, I played the recordings I made, which are now at Purdue University. Janet went to Purdue too, by the way. She was a home economics major. But my recordings of both Neil's interviews and the 16 hours of Janet's are in the archives at Purdue. I think they've been digitized. And there was a lot of concern about Claire Foy being able to have the Midwestern Chicago accent that Janet had. And so I gave Claire a number of my recorded tapes so she could listen to Janet. And I think she really nailed it. I mean, she did a great job of not sounding British and sounding like she's from suburban Chicago. But anyway, the whole journey that I experienced, I mean, just through the book, I mean, if the movie had never happened, it would have still been an absolutely extraordinary experience for me as an author of a book that I knew no one else had ever been able to do, and no one else was ever going to be able to do again, not in the way I did it, because so many of those people that I talked to, including Neil, are gone. And their papers are, some of them are blowing in the wind. A lot of them would be still available, and I think there probably will be every generation or two, there needs to be a restudy of a major figure. And so there'll be another Armstrong biography that will be offering fresh insights down the road. But none of them are going to have what I was able to get. And so I feel immensely privileged. And then the movie raised another whole set of issues for me as that came along.
No, I think one of my favorite things, and this is one of my favorite aspects of doing this podcast as scholars, as the three of us are historians, is the fact that you're able to go off and really, so much of what we do as scholars are consult primary sources from some other age or era collected by someone else. And then in this case, whereas you're conducting these oral histories, you're actually creating these primary sources
Yeah.
that, again, these next generations of scholars, or we ourselves right now, can enjoy, because I do just generally enjoy history, right? And there's a real aspect here, Jim, of just the creation of history that I really admire, and just you're talking about these aspects of like going to how do you gain the trust of someone who you don't know, who's never heard of you or anything like that, and thinks, oh, they're in it just for whatever, right? um, how do you earn that trust? How do you carry forth and ensure that that trust was not misplaced, and honor the agreements? As a scholar, I think you've got obligations to tell a story as honestly as you possibly can, yet at the same time you're not you're not trying to destroy the relationships and things like that, or destroy uh, the terms of which you're able to get this information and stuff. So I'm giddy to hear more about this. I want to talk a little bit about the film.
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
we only, believe me, a hallmark of this podcast is like talking about the movie for about 3 minutes, or not talking about it for about the first 45. So we're doing great. um, I was ready to go on a tangent about how much I love Cincinnati as a native Kentuckian. So,
Mhm.
but in this movie, we only see Neil and Jan's life for about 8 years. The film, I think, starts in
Right.
61, kind of goes through to 69. So, and the first time we see Neil Armstrong, we see him, he's a test pilot. It's a very tense scene. And I'm kind of wondering, when we meet Neil in this film, say in 1961, because
Mhm.
gosh, it feels like this is a guy that's hard to get to know. Who is he in 1961? Who is this guy 8 years before Apollo?
Well, that's a great question, and my first thing that comes to my mind is, the one challenge for the book and for the filmmaker was, Neil became an icon. I mean, he became a very iconic figure in American life. Um, Even though he wasn't well known, I mean, his personal story was not really all that well known. There was the NASA version of his personal story, but that was about it. What I wanted to do in the book, and what Chazelle wanted to do in the movie, was let's see the man. Let's see who the man was. Not now they're not that they're. It's impossible, as I found, to remove the iconography around somebody like this when there's so much of it wrapped into him or projected onto him. But we meet him in late 61. We meet him up in the X-15 flying. But the key thing for the storyline in the movie was we were meeting him at a very difficult time in his life, because his little beloved daughter, Karen, who he calls Muffy, has been diagnosed with really a terminal cancer, a glioma of the pons, a malignant brain tumor. And she's going through some really rugged treatment, including the attempt at cobalt treatments, which was very tough on a little. I mean, the little girl had learned to walk. She was a little bit over 2 years old, but because of the cobalt treatment, she couldn't even walk anymore. And here he is flying this machine up to the very edge of the atmosphere, in one of the most dangerous, and radically designed experimental aircraft ever, the X-15, the rocket-powered airplane. And he's doing it at a time when the daughter is very badly ill and is within weeks of dying. And so that opens up the story in a way. I mean, it shows him as in his profession, it shows him as a pilot on the very edge of things. He gets a glimpse of space, in that scene when the X-15 gets up to its highest altitude. But he comes back, and there's an incident in the flight that we tried to do as accurately as possible. There was some ballooning. At one point, the X-15 is like bouncing off the atmosphere, and he's got to get it back down, and he barely is able to get it back down. And we tried as best we could to make everything. We had A lot of we had former X-15 pilots helping us make sure we did it right and explained it right. But he comes back down, and the very next scene you see is they're inside of a hospital setting where she's in the cobalt machine, and then she dies shortly thereafter. So what the movie is setting up is a specific period of his life, which was the most intensely emotional and distressing period that any person could go through. And what people didn't really, what I tried to do in the book, and what the movie does, I think, even better, is that starting with the death of and actually in the book you back it up before that. I mean, Neil had experienced the death of pilots and friends going back to his teenage years, and in combat in Korea he lost a couple of guys that he was really, really close to. So the movie doesn't even touch those tragedies, those losses. But what the movie then does is track a succession of really tough losses and high risk things that happened, that involved the death of Muffy, which motivates him. When the book explores this, he has other problems flying in the period after Muffy's death. There's like one period of his life where he's his professional test pilot life where he's encountering some difficulties that I associate with the period of after Muffy's death. Then he decides, well, he needs a new start somewhere, and he sees this ad for Project Gemini, and he gets involved and puts his name in, but he's not sure he wants to put his name in. The one thing that I think the movie does cover this briefly, but it might have been missed by most of the audience, is that he waited till the very last minute to send his application in, and in fact his application for astronaut selection missed the deadline. And only because there was a guy on the committee in Houston, Dick Day, who was in charge as kind of the secretary for the selection committee. Dick Day had worked out at Edwards with Neil and knew Neil was a great pilot. Probably didn't even know about the death of Muffy, because a lot of that was such a private thing. I mean, Neil didn't share that. Janet shared it with some friends, but when his application comes in late, Dick Day just sort of slides it in the pile of applications, so it gets considered. So it shows the ambivalence on Neil's part, that even that he was after a new start, he wasn't sure he wanted to end his life as a test pilot. And so you've got that happening as a motivation for him moving to NASA, having this new life.
Jim, if I can interrupt you
So,
just for a second there, just to kind of emphasize emphasize that part a little bit. You're talking about this tragedy that Neil goes through, and he needs a fresh start somewhere. So what does he do? He applies for literally the most elite fraternity in the world. I'm going to go become an astronaut. I'm going to go join this cadre of men who are perhaps the most famous Americans in the world. But for him, that's a change of scenery. So that's just kind of a striking decision. And like you say, he's even ambivalent about it. Whereas how many test pilots are like, I want to do this above all things. And Neil's like, well, here's a good change of scenery for me. So that just really speaks to his kind of mindset there in just a very dramatic way that, you see that in the movie, but I just wanted to call that out because to me that's just a really striking.
No, that's a good insight, Kevin. I guess I was just to quickly move through the storyline that you all know, that people who watch the movie have known, and that is that when he becomes a good friend of Elliot C. Well, what happens to Elliot C? He has the accident coming into St. Louis, and he's killed, in the flight. So one of Neil's great friends and then there's the Apollo fire. Ed White lives next door. In the movie, he lives across the street because the movie people weren't able to get the lot that they wanted to have them side by side, so they found a house that'd work across the street. But there's the Apollo fire, so he loses Ed, and of course Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee as well. Then he almost dies himself in the Gemini 8 mission. Easily Scott and him could have not come back from that flight if they hadn't been quick to react and get that thruster turned off, or turn the other one on to cancel it out. Then there was the LLTV accident where he within a fraction of a second, if he'd been later in ejecting, he probably would have been killed in that crash. And then you've got the dangers of Apollo 11. I mean, he goes through a whole succession of there in just the 8 years that you've mentioned earlier, Jason, that he goes through loss, high risk, and the movie tries to portray that and the effects that has on him, which means a lot for how Neil's depicted. Now, one criticism of the movie from some people that knew Neil was that Neil comes across as kind of morose and always depressed and not smiling and all this kind of stuff. When they say, "Well, I knew Neil in later years, and he could be the life of the party. He was very, very, very lighthearted." Well, not during this period of time. He wasn't. I mean, just because he might have been that way in 1995 or something at a cocktail party, doesn't necessarily mean he's we're tracing something that is highly intensely personal, and a lot of people don't even know that he's gone through a lot of this stuff. Even fellow astronauts don't know that Karen even existed because it was never discussed. And so what the movie tries to do is show how much of a cost this moon landing program was, and to personify it in the one person who maybe most deserves it to be personified. Not that the other astronauts didn't. I mean, they went through other things too. I mean, the White family, what they went through, what the Grissom family went through, what the Chaffee family went through. It was everybody. There were lots of deaths and things that were losses, that sacrifices to get this moon landing done. But we focus it on Neil, and even to counter some of the criticism of Neil being too depressing in the movie. If you go back and watch it again and look at the number of times that he smiles or laughs or is playing with the children or joking about being in musical theater, when they're sitting around the table with the Chafees or the C's and the Whites, they're being joking around him being involved with musical theater when he was at Purdue. There's a lot of lighthearted moments. I don't know how many more you needed. And of course the big controversy of the movie, which I'm sure you're going to ask about, is the concern over Chazelle choosing not to show the actual planting of the American flag in the Sea of Tranquility, which became the controversy of the movie, as if somehow people hadn't watched the movie, but they just sort of, what, you can't have a movie about Apollo 11 and not show the flag being planted. Well, the flags are all over that movie. I mean, those who wanted to project a negative meaning onto the film for whatever reasons they're doing it, political or otherwise, you could say it was an anti-American movie. But if you really, you could project whatever you wanted on that movie. I've read most all of the reviews of it, critiques and plaudits. And the truth of the matter is, I've seen critiques of the movie that sort of people that thought it was like an un-American left-wing movie. And then there are others. There was a long review in the New Yorker magazine where they said it was a right-wing movie. It was a blatantly chauvinistic American right-wing movie. So you could project whatever you want onto the film, but it's too bad, at least in terms of box office, that it got embroiled in this flag controversy. Because we went back one viewing, a group of my contacts on the movie, and we watched and counted how many times you could see an American flag in the movie. I think we stopped counting at about 90. I mean, the American flag's all over the dang movie. It's just not being shown planted. It's shown in the moon surface, but it doesn't have Buzz and Neil, because that wasn't what the movie had to show. When we got to the moon, we needed to show something else that was personal to Neil. And so that was what we had to focus on. And it wasn't a documentary about Apollo 11, which we have a very good Apollo 11 documentary film that came out about the same time. They did a great job with that. So I know I'm moving this story along a little bit more fast than you might want, but that's kind of where my mind goes. So.
I kind of wonder, because we talked a little bit, Jim, you talked a little bit about being on set. We talked a little bit earlier about getting about Gosling. I'm wondering, how Gosling kind of, in your own experience, kind of came to know Neil of this time, if that makes any sense. How does he get in touch with, trying to portray this man, this really larger than life man who is impossible to know? How does he, how did you get a chance to talk to him at all?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I did. And Ryan, whenever Ryan saw me coming into the area of his area. I tried not to bother Chazelle and Gosling or any of the actors that much, but if Gosling saw me kind of approaching slowly and tentatively, if he caught my eye, he would stop whatever he was doing and come right over to me, which I appreciated immensely. And then once he invited me back to the trailer to have a beer with him, and so I had lunch with him a couple of times. Chazelle was the same way. If Chazelle had a question, a lot of Chazelle, directors are like unbelievably busy on set. I mean, they're like the king's court, and so what I would do, and he at his invitation, is at the end of a day, if I had some thoughts, I'd email him, and he would email me back sometimes midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. He would respond almost all the time, and sometimes I'd be called, on the microphone, Jim, come to the Damien wants to talk to you. I do that occasionally, but both of them had done really thorough research. And as for Ryan specifically, not only had I thought read my book pretty carefully, which is probably unusual for most actors doing a role from a book, but he had both Mark and Rick Armstrong, the two sons, were on set a lot. And Ryan and Damien actually went to Ohio, went to the Armstrong Museum, and went out to the farm where Neil was born, where they met Neil's sister and Coach Osolikoff, who was one of Neil's best boyhood friends. Asked a lot of questions about Neil. And I remember one conversation that I had with Ryan early on, because there were certain aspects of the story that I thought, I felt like I had a real responsibility to Neil. He had died in 2012. The book had come out 7 years earlier. He was happy enough with the book, but I felt like I had to protect him in some way, protect who he was, and protect the book in some respects as well. I knew it was a movie. I knew there would be some fictionalization, but I wanted to keep it as real as I could. And I remember having one conversation with Ryan, and asking him, because I was bothered by something, I think, in the script that had him saying something I didn't think was appropriate. And Ryan, it wasn't just about that, but Ryan gave me sort of his philosophy of acting and playing a real life character. And that was that he felt like he wanted to integrate Armstrong into the character as best as he could, but it wasn't going to be a mechanical one-on-one relationship of Neil Armstrong to his acting, that the actor brings something new to the character and you want the actor to do that. It's a rendition. It's a rendition of the character. It's not a mechanical, mannequin of the actor. And that's what a good actor, I think, does. He brings his own brain, his own creativity, his own spirit to the film. And was, for people that really knew Neil, and I think I ended up knowing him pretty darn well, is it exactly Neil Armstrong? Nah, it's not. But what character can you tell me that in the movies is exactly the time the actor who played Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, Gregory Peck. Is Gregory Peck really? I mean, of course, Atticus Finch is a fictional character, so that makes it a little bit easier to do it. But I really bothered me when people would write me afterwards and say, I knew Neil and that wasn't Neil Armstrong. Well, no, it wasn't. It wasn't an absolute replica of Neil Armstrong. But I'd also wonder, well, when did you know him and how did you really know him? Did you have 16 hours of private one-on-one conversation with his wife like I did? She told me some things that I guarantee you not anybody, maybe nobody else knew that she told me about. Yeah, but I really benefited from Ryan taking me and not talking down to me at all. It was a real one-on-one direct conversation, telling me his philosophy of playing a real person and what the actor needed to do to bring that person to life in a way that may not be exact, but it's artistic. And that's what the people have to understand about the film, is that it's an art form, and it becomes something. It's something different. It's something more, maybe in some ways something less, but it's something different from what the real life experience was. But it's a good version of it. It's a powerful, emotive, illuminating version of what that person was and what life he had.
This film is called First Man, right? But so much of this story revolves around Jan and
Yeah.
their relationship, and rightfully so. Can we talk a little bit about who she is in '61 as well? Because this is really, in a lot of ways, the story of how the two of them get us to the moon.
Yeah.
Um, who is she in 1961? Like, where is their relationship? And I guess, is she driving him to, is she supporting his mission to, like, to his idea to become an astronaut? Like, where is their relationship in this time?
Well, she's definitely supporting him, but what you don't get quite enough of in the movie, I don't think, is when the little girl, when their baby girl dies, which is the worst loss a couple can go through. Neil goes back to work about as quickly as he can. Within a couple of days after the burial of the baby, he's back flying. It's his way of dealing with it. And to some extent, it's just what a man would do. But I don't accept that terminology. I don't accept that version altogether because I'm a man and I know I wouldn't be able to handle it in that exactly that way. Janet, when I interviewed her, made it very clear that she needed more from Neil. She needed him in the aftermath of the death of the child, and she didn't need him just to go back to work and be okay for himself. She needed him. The family needed him. Ricky, with the first child, was born, and Mark would come later. But Neil was so driven, and maybe driven to some extent, to get away from the tragedy of the loss of the child. His sister June told me that Neil's love for the daughter was so amazing. I mean, not that he didn't love his boys, but the special relationship in the father and the daughter was really something to behold. But Janet made it clear to me in my interview time with her that they had another child. They stayed married for many, many years. But one of the feelings I had after listening to her talk to me for 16 hours was, how did this marriage last so long? And that's an insight that I guarantee you, I know from firsthand conversations with some of his best closest friends of astronauts, Dave Scott, Lovell, Gene Cernan. They never had any idea that the marriage was in any way, dysfunctional. But that's exactly the word Janet used with me, that the marriage was dysfunctional. And she was bothered by the fact that she knew that he becomes an astronaut. She's going to be the good wife. She's raising two babies, two baby sons. She's going to work through it. She's going to do her best. She's going to be supportive. But she couldn't. In the end, she divorces Neil. She divorces him after many more years of marriage than I would have, that a biographer would really expect to have happened, because she said she just couldn't be Neil Armstrong's wife anymore. That he wouldn't engage. If she wanted to talk to him about something, he may not want to talk to her at all about it. It's kind of the scene, although a lot of the scene is manufactured near the end of the movie when he's packing up to go
Yeah.
to the launch pad to get ready to go on the moon trip, and she's trying to interact with him and get him to talk to the boys, and that's something that came right out of my interview with him. She told me that she was insistent that he sit the boys down and address their issues, address their questions, and tell them he might not come back. And actually, what she told me, my take on it is, the movie. I mean, if you remember that scene, it's a pretty dramatic movie scene. She knocks the briefcase off the table. She uses a curse word, and some people say, "Oh, that seems too extreme." Well, I can tell you from the time I spent with her, I think it was less extreme than what it probably really was. I mean, so I don't think that was really overdone. And the boys, Rick and Mark, I mean, they didn't have any quarrels with that. I mean, they realized there was some fictionalization in that particular episode of the movie. But anyway, so Janet was someone who, was the good. You have to understand the generation. I mean, here she's, they marry in the mid 50s. They're raising their family in the 60s and 70s. Her husband, his first, this professional pilot and a government person, an astronaut. Then he becomes first man on the moon. And I think she's always hoping that things are going to change. That once he gets out of the astronaut corps, he takes this job at the University of Cincinnati, which is what he does. They have moved to this farm. They're going to get away from it all. It's going to be better. And then when the boys finally leave high school and they're going to college, then it's going to get better when it's empty nesters. And she eventually realizes it's not going to change. I mean, she loves him still, but she just doesn't want that life anymore. And I'll add one other thing, which is, I think, very insightful. When I tell the audiences this, they can't believe it's true, but they married in a very unusual way. They never dated. They never dated before they got married. Neil met her at Purdue. Neil had come back from 2 years in Korea. So he came back. He was an older guy. He was very mature, even for the age that he was very mature. She was very popular. She dated a lot of guys. She's a very good looking woman. She had been at Purdue. Neil's brother Dean actually knew her before Neil knew her. Neil got a crush on her and was too afraid to ask her out. He made some approaches, but then when he got his government job out of college, he got a job with the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, as a test pilot. He first went up to Lewis Laboratory in Cleveland, which becomes the John Glenn Research Center. And he flies for a few months there. And then he gets a chance to go out to Edwards, the NACA facility there, to fly. And he knows he's going to be flying a lot of different experimental airplanes, eventually the X-15. So he knows he's going to got this government job. And so he drives his car from Ohio. Janet, during the summer, she's a swimming instructor at a camp in central Wisconsin. So he goes up to Wisconsin, asks her to marry him out of the blue. She doesn't even know he's coming. He arrives, and she says, okay. She decides she'll marry him. They hadn't really dated, but she knew he had a government job. He was getting a mileage allowance and food allowance to go across the country. He promised her that he had a cabin that he was going to rent in out on the Mojave Desert. And she thought, well, he's mature. He's got a government job. He's unlike all the other boys I've dated. So I'll give it a shot. So when they marry each other, they don't really even know each other that well. I mean, They're really almost strangers. And then, then they have their romance. I'm not suggesting they didn't have that, but then very early on within the first 5 years of their marriage, their baby daughter gets brain cancer and she dies. And then Neil's, and so it's just a really interesting type of marriage. And I think the movie does a pretty good job of at least subtext. Some of this is subtext, but I don't think the movie ever really advances that as far as the book does, or as far as they could have done legitimately, because the marriage, as I said, Janet used the word dysfunctional. And some of the stuff she told me off, people would not believe. And not that it's that negative. It isn't. I mean, Neil wasn't abusive or anything like that, but there were things about him that you wouldn't expect any woman to put up with for too long. And the movie doesn't really depict that very well.
Yeah, well, that gets down to the idea that even our heroes are human.
Oh, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, warts and all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to ask Kevin, maybe we can talk a little bit about Gemini before we move on to Apollo, because Gemini is such an important aspect to this. I'm a sucker for training scenes in anything, whether it's Rocky or this film. And, then you start seeing all these guys show up. I want to talk about Corey Stoll as Buzz Aldrin, because Corey Stoll as anybody in a film he's in my mind, one of the most magnetic, amazing actors, period. And Aldrin does not come off looking great in this film at all. But before we get into that, can we talk a little bit about what's Gemini, and why is Gemini important to the Apollo story? How does all this stuff, for someone who doesn't know how these pieces fit together, how does this work?
Yeah. So Gemini was that middle program, and I'm going to give the filmmakers credit, because everybody in the film actually calls it Gemini, not Gemini.
Gemini.
Right. I was like, what?
Earlier tonight. Yeah. Gemini. That's right.
Yeah,
Gemini.
every that's this debate among the space geek set is how to pronounce it. But I'll say from firsthand experience, everybody that I've interviewed or spoken with who was actually involved with the program, to a man, they all say Gemini. So I picked up on saying it that way as well. So kudos to the filmmakers for that decision. Jim, I don't know if you had anything to do with that or not, but
A little bit, but you can see that I violate that principle
right.
because I think I said Gemini. There's actually one reference in the movie that there is one Gemini that slips in there. I don't know if we missed it in
Mhm.
cut or what, but we let it go.
I heard it.
And
So yeah, distracting from the question though, but yeah, so the one thing to know about Gemini being this, it's the classic middle child, right, of the early space program. You have Mercury, the pioneers. You've got Apollo, the moon landing, and actually Apollo started before Gemini, right? But NASA realized they're going to have a big gap between the end of the Mercury program and the start of Apollo, and particularly once Apollo got into this idea of lunar orbit rendezvous that they talk about in the film, that there's going to be a whole lot of things they have to do in space that was well beyond anything they had tested in Mercury. So they need some way to get up in space and practice all of these techniques before anything from Apollo is going to be ready. Even the kind of early generation of Apollo that with the Apollo 1 fire that all got canceled, the Block One program. So they created Gemini to be this kind of gap filler. Well, okay, we're going to practice working in space. And one of the people who worked on it had told me that Gemini wasn't really that important for the engineering side of things. It wasn't like, hey, we're learning how to build hardware. It was critical for operations, the flight controllers, the astronauts, to learn how to work in space. And that's really the value for the Gemini program. And so here's where you send up these flights. It's Gemini 4 through 12 that go up there doing everything from the first extravehicular activity on, or I'm sorry, Gemini 3 through 12. Of course, Gemini 3 with Gus Grissom and John Young, which that must have been a very interesting flight. Two of the more stoic astronauts together. But then Gemini 4 that they show in the film with the first spacewalk with Ed White, which was actually kind of thrown together in just about 2 months. That hey, we need to go do this EVA because the Soviets are doing this EVA. But then that also gave them this sort of false sense of accomplishment there because Ed got out, flew around, had his little squirt gun, and they thought, well, this isn't too bad. So they skipped a couple of flights, and then the next EVA that they end up doing, well, there's supposed to be one on Gemini 8 with Neil, of course, and part of that is they're going to test one of these a more advanced version of a backpack to go fly around. Obviously, they have that problem on board, so they never get to actually do the EVA or test any of this equipment. Gemini 9 comes along. Gene Cernan is going to do the really advanced version of it, the classic Buck Rogers jetpack and fly around. But because they hadn't done any EVAs, they hadn't realized the difficulties associated with this. And so that ends up being what he calls the EVA from hell. He can't, control his body as he's moving along the outside of the capsule. He's getting tangled up in his umbilical cord. His spacesuits, their suits, which weren't designed to do an EVA in the first place, had inadequate cooling inside. So he's overheating. He turns like beet red and he's drops like 20 pounds in sweat. I mean, it's just really crazy. But if they hadn't gone through these experiences, and EVA just being one example, rendezvous and docking like they did on Gemini 8 was a great example. If you can't rendezvous in space, well, then lunar orbit rendezvous isn't going to happen, right? You can't do that whole mission, so that somebody's got to demonstrate that. So two earlier Gemini capsules did rendezvous in space, just to show that they could do it to figure out the orbital mechanics. But that's, Neil's got that great explanation in the movie where he's talking about, well, if you try to accelerate, you actually go into a higher orbit, and so you fall behind. The sort of weird counterintuitive orbital mechanics. That's something NASA had to figure out on the fly when they first tried to rendezvous with an Agena, I think it was earlier in the program. So by the time Neil's mission gets around, they had figured this out. Okay, here's how we can actually rendezvous with something in space. And then once you're close enough, you can do the more sort of classic maneuvering to actually dock. And so great, Gemini 8 proves that. Then, as the movie shows in a very visceral way, that they had that problem there. They almost die, but they get it figured out enough that they save their lives. And Jim's got a great section in the book where he talks about this. How do you interpret what happens on Gemini 8? Was that a failure? Did Neil screw up by ending that mission, by separating from the Agena? Yeah, it was the wrong decision to do in hindsight because the problem wasn't with the Agena. Or was it the right thing to do because they didn't really trust the Agena the same way that they trusted the Gemini capsule? So they got to go through all these missions in the Gemini program to basically have to steepen or to flatten that learning curve before they got into Apollo, into the moon landing, where things would really count. Because if you had these problems on the way to the moon, like Apollo 13 showed, you're in much bigger trouble than you are in Earth orbit. Could you imagine if you had that stuck thruster and you're spinning and flying, somewhere halfway between the Earth and the moon? You're in pretty big trouble. So the fact that they could iron those bugs out, figure out, hey, what are our weaknesses in training? How can we better train for something like happened on Gemini 8 or for EVA or whatever it is? And they did very much improve the EVA techniques, doing the underwater training and all of that kind of stuff. But Gemini provided that critical middle period for the flight controllers, for the astronauts to learn how to actually function in space. So when they got to the moon, things were much easier. They could just concentrate on the moon critical stuff and less on, hey, how do we do this communication? How do we, get outside the spacecraft and all of those different functions? And so I guess I left out sort of the generic parts. Gemini's a 2-man program. It's basically a Mercury capsule on steroids. It goes into Earth orbit and does these variety of missions and all of that. So, critical program, and it often overlooked because it didn't have the excitement of being the first like Mercury or being the moon landing like Apollo. But it was absolutely
Middle
necessary to be
child.
done in the middle there. Yeah.
Jim, I want to ask you because you said earlier that Neil would talk about a lot of things during your conversations, but if you ask him about certain things, he'd only say a few things. Like Buzz Aldrin
Yeah.
said, he'd only say a few words. I'm wondering if, by your intimation, those words had 4 letters to them.
No.
I'm kind of wondering. You've got all these guys, and we talked about. There's almost like this foregone conclusion, at least in the film, that Neil is this hyper competent guy who's like, okay, I'm just going to go be Kevin said this earlier. I'm just going to go be part of this super alpha, awesome squad of guys, of geniuses. Do these guys like each other? Do they get on well with one another? Is there a competitive spirit? Like, what's their relationships like? Because these guys are working awfully close together.
Yeah, I think it depends on which individuals you're mentioning. I think they all had closer buddies than others. Neil was close with Elliot. See, he was close with Ed White. Um, I think Neil was a good. I think his friendships were maybe not as deep as maybe some of the other ones. He didn't. Pete Conrad, he liked Pete well enough, but Pete was just a different personality. Neil doesn't necessarily gravitate towards the Conrad personality. He'd be more fun. He liked Collins a lot, and everybody liked Collins. But I think the question behind your question has to do with Neil and Buzz probably, and that's a endlessly fascinating subject. I did ask him about Buzz, and then I had lengthy interviews with Buzz too, and I always asked, I tried to get as much. Neil didn't like talking about people that much. He would talk about theories and principles and engineering, but he would go on at length. But when you asked him about a person, and it wasn't like he was trying to hide anything, I just don't think his mind went there. He wasn't interested in. He wouldn't be watching soap operas. He's not interested in that.
He's not a Real Housewives guy.
No, not a Real Housewives guy. And so, I did. There were things about Buzz that I could get from him, but they were all kind of there were a lot of inferences that I needed to make. The key part of the story that I focused on in the one part of the book had to do with first out. Who was going to be first out?
Yeah.
Coming out of the Gemini program. Like I said, Gemini that time, Kevin. I was thinking about this.
We can have Fletcher, our producer, go back and change everything later.
Yeah. Coming out of the Gemini program, in the Gemini program, it wasn't the commander that went out for the EVA. It was the other guy. And coming out of Gemini, there was some people thought there was a precedent that would carry over into Apollo, that the person who'd go out of the spacecraft after its landing would be the number 2 guy, and the commanding officer would stay with the ship. Well, it was a big difference between being the commanding officer of a Gemini spacecraft that's still in orbit and a lunar module that has landed and is sitting still on the lunar surface. Do you really need the commanding officer to stay in there? So they basically rethought it. I mean, when the time came, and there are all kinds of stories that go with this issue. I mean, one thing that became kind of the NASA PR position was that the commanding officer had to go out first because the way the hatch was designed, that the hatch opened in a certain way that it would be inconvenient for the lunar module pilot, Aldrin, to go out first. It was easier for the commander to go out first. And so based on those simulations of the movements inside this tiny little lunar, which the walls were so thin a pencil could go through. You didn't want to have a bunch of messing around. That it had to be and that's what NASA came out with to explain why Armstrong would be the first out and not Aldrin. Aldrin wasn't totally happy with that. There's a lot of stories about Aldrin wondering why the decision was made the way that it was. Aldrin's father coming to NASA, and he was kind of an executive with Shell Oil, and he had connections, and he wondered why his son wasn't going to be the first out. Neil was so quiet. Buzz made the argument, well, Neil's not going to be able to verbalize the experience as well as I'm going to be able to do it. So there was part of that. But the key for me became when I interviewed Christopher Kraft, the head of Mission Control. Kraft, there was a meeting between Kraft, George Lowe, and Deke Slayton. A conversation. It wasn't a formal meeting. It was a conversation that the three of them had, and it had to do with this issue because the newspapers and magazines, everybody was asking, well, who's going to be first out? Once the Apollo 11 crew was named in January of 1969, then, well, okay, Armstrong's commander, but who's going to go out first? I mean, we've heard that there's this precedent in Gemini. Is it going to be Buzz? Is it going to be Neil? So NASA was under a little bit of pressure to sort of make it clear why it was going to be. And so there was a conversation between these three guys about who was going to be first out. And the consensus was, long story short, was that Neil was another Lindbergh type. He was the calm, collected, stoic, he doesn't get flustered easily. He's going to be able to handle the press without saying too much. He's not going to go off half-cocked saying things that aren't relevant. Buzz, on the other hand, might. They knew him well enough to know that he might. And they said, and in this agreement, the private agreement, it's got to be Armstrong. We can't put Buzz in that role because whoever does this is going to be a world historical figure. Is going to be this icon for the ages, and Armstrong's the perfect guy for that, and Buzz just isn't. And so that was the decision that was made that really ruled the day. But what can you don't go out to the press. Kraft doesn't have a press conference and say, well, we made a decision. It's going to be Armstrong because we can't trust Buzz to do it. You can't right. say anything like that. So they go back to this ruse that it's about the inner dynamics of the lunar module cabin, which, I talked to every astronaut that I could about this once I figured some of this out. I remember talking to Alan Bean, who was Buzz Aldrin for Apollo 12, right? Okay, with Pete Conrad. And I said, what about this? And Bean, I can't remember exactly where, but it was something like, oh, that was just BS. If they wanted the lunar module pilot out first, it would have been no problem because when you're in the lunar module cabin, you don't have your spacesuit on yet. You don't have the backpack on. You don't have your gear to go on. If they wanted the command module pilot or the lunar module pilot out first, Buzz over on this side, they could just, before they gear up, they could just change places. That would be no problem. They could just change places, and then they could suit up, and then Buzz would be over there in the spot to go through that hatch easiest, but Neil would have to wait. So it was just I mean, why the press never figured that out, I don't know. Maybe somebody did. I didn't run across it, but that was NASA's double talk, or its smokescreen to why it had to be. But it also made sense. I mean, it wasn't just because Armstrong was going to be the perfect icon. In some ways, he wasn't a perfect icon. He was just maybe better than Buzz would have been. But I mean, it made the sense for the commander to go out first. I mean, it just did, given that the space, you don't need to be the machines shut off at that period of time. You don't really need a commanding officer making sure that everything's okay at the controls. But Buzz never really let this go, and I have evidence. There was in 1972, 3 years after Apollo 11, Buzz makes a special appointment with George Low, and the main purpose, I mean, the only purpose really of going to see Low was he wants to know why but Neil went out first, why it wasn't him. Well, if Buzz really didn't care, which is kind of what I mean, that's Buzz's line when he was been asked about this to people. He would say, "Well, I just wanted it cleared up. It wasn't that I was campaigning to be the first out. We were getting questions about it, and I just wanted it cleared up. So that's why I was raising questions about it and trying to get NASA to make a resolution of this back at the time." Well, if that was really true, then why in the heck is he making an appointment with George Low in 1972 to question the decision about who was going to be first out? I think it did bother Buzz, and just to put a finishing touch on the Neil Buzz relationship, after the Apollo 11 mission came back and went through quarantine and so forth, they made the giant step tour around the world. I don't know, 48 countries in 60 days or whatever it was. Cover this in the book pretty quick. We don't have it in the movie, of course. It's beyond the scope of the movie. But they went to all over the place. They went to, and Neil did tell me a couple of stories. I mean, Buzz is very honest, and I respect him a lot for it. But Buzz had a little bit of a drinking problem that he's written about in his own memoir. So I'm not telling tales on him. But when they were in different capital cities around the world, there were always big celebrations and parties for the astronauts and everything. And Buzz a couple of times kind of was acting out. I mean, one night in Rome, he doesn't come home. He doesn't come back to the hotel the whole night. Of course, the wives are all back in the hotel, all the astronauts' wives. In the Congo, which was then the Congo, there's Miss Congo is doing a native dance with a bunch of other dancers. Buzz has had a little bit too much Congo drink in him, and he goes up to the Miss Congo and starts dancing and fondling her, and Neil has to call him aside a couple of times and tell him, that he's going to have to shape up or ship out. They'll make up an excuse and they'll send him back to the United States because he's embarrassing the United States of America. And Neil did tell me those stories about that. So Collins had the last word for me on Buzz. What Mike told me was that it's not that Buzz doesn't know right from wrong. He just doesn't know appropriate from inappropriate. And I experienced that myself. When I interviewed him, I picked him up at the airport in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and when I took him to his hotel, the next morning he had appointments late in the morning with some of the space industries. So he needed me there bright and early, 6:30 in the morning. I went there at 6:30 in the morning, and I won't divulge it all, but Buzz was just in his underwear for 2 hours while I interviewed him in the hotel room. And I can tell you, by then I knew Neil pretty well. There's no way in God's good earth that Neil Armstrong would ever be in his underwear when I visited him at his home to do an interview. No way, just no way. But Buzz, I had never met him. I talked to him on the phone. He's in his underwear, skimpy underwear, for 2 hours in a hotel room with me in a suit coat and a cut tie and my laptop and my recording machines. It was pretty bizarre. So anyway, appropriate from inappropriate. That captures Buzz for me. Brilliant guy, no question. He's a
Hey,
Go
Jason,
ahead, Kevin.
yeah, if I can chime in first with an aside and then with a question for Jim. Um, it's always been my contention that everything in aerospace history comes back to Dayton, and Buzz Aldrin's a good example. His
Yeah.
his father, Edwin Aldrin Sr., was one of our
Oh,
guys. He worked at
yeah.
McCook Field here in Dayton, and starting in 1919. He was a pilot there and also a member of the first class of what's now the Air Force Institute of Technology at Wright-Patt, and he was head of the curriculum there. And so we've got pictures of him next to his airplanes and with the class and stuff like that at McCook Field, which was the kind of the predecessor for Wright-Patt right here in
Sure.
Dayton. So he spent several years here. So we consider him the dad, at least one of our guys, before he went on to bigger and better things outside of Dayton.
And the story with his father, the father-son relationship, is that Buzz never really, uh, never quite cuts it for the father. I mean, I think Buzz finishes third in West Point class, and what his father says is, "Well, why didn't you finish first or second?" It's like that kind of thing. So
Classic guy.
Buzz was trying to satisfy a father that was very, very hard to satisfy. And so when he was going to be number two out, it's like he thought, well, he better be number one again because his father's not going to think highly enough of him. But yeah, so that father-son relationship is really, I think there should be a good biography of Buzz written. I mean, he's written books about himself, but that's not the same thing as writing a biography. And
For sure.
there are times I have considered writing a biography of Buzz, but it's just the pitfalls of that are too many for me at my age to try to handle. But we need a good independent biography of Buzz.
I was just going to say, just to throw in my question there, which is related, but talking about Neil, do you think Jim, if he had his preference with perfect hindsight, do you think he still would have chosen to be the guy on Apollo 11, or would he have been happier being the commander of Apollo 12 or 14 or something like that, getting to the moon but not being thrust into the limelight for the rest of his life?
Well, I think he would have that's a question he would have engaged, and I think I did talk to him a little bit about it. I think Neil would have been he would have done whatever he was asked to do. Whatever, it was nothing foreordained that Apollo 11 would even be the first landing, and a lot of things had to happen, including the Apollo fire, for things to get mixed up
Right.
and ordered the way they were. So Neil would have been happy with whatever he had and would have done his very best, whatever it was. And certainly, in retrospect, after he flew Apollo 11, I mean, Scott flew Apollo 10 and Apollo 15, right? Dave Scott did. Do I have my numbers right? Um, but after Neil came back from the moon, they weren't going to let him go up again. So that was one of the downsides. He could have, if it hadn't been the first landing mission and he hadn't become the iconic first walker, he might have had a chance to keep flying, and he would have probably done that. And he certainly didn't. He wouldn't. He did not relish. He did not enjoy being first man. I mean, he didn't really like the title of the book when I told him what I wanted to use, because I said I want to use it because it suggests not just the personal story, but the iconography of the story, which the second half of the book goes into in some detail. The movie doesn't do that. We don't really maybe need to because everybody kind of has it in their head anyway. But um, he tried his best to live a sane life afterwards, and in some ways he succeeded nicely, and in other ways not so nicely. I would think that any other person that went through it, maybe if they liked the celebrity, if they liked the limelight more, they might have enjoyed it more. They might have exploited it more. Uh, and Neil was never about to do that. He had a number of opportunities where he could have made a lot more money than he did by taking on advertising or becoming this or becoming that. And the fact that he wasn't the type to do that, I think it reinforces NASA's decision to make it him. But again, he wasn't. Once it was clear that he was the commanding officer and commander of the mission, and Buzz was the lunar module pilot, then it was the no-brainer for them that Neil needed to go out first. But it wasn't like a decision that they ever sat around and said, "Okay, we got these 15 good commanding officers that we could use, the different commanders for these missions. Now, which one? Let's pick one that would be the best to be first man." He never did that, and it would have been an interesting conversation because they might have been, they would have maybe felt good about Lovell or someone else, or Gus when Gus was still living. Um, But yeah, I guess that's all I had to say about that.
I hate to belabor the point here, but since we are talking about the lunar mission, and I've never spoken to anyone who's been on the moon, and Jim, you have,
Yeah,
Kevin, you have too, right? Like I'm we don't really get a sense like when we see the film, I think we're trying to take it in for the majesty of it and so forth, but I'm kind of wondering, did Armstrong share with you, like was he afraid when you opened this door, like you're about to step on an extraterrestrial body here? What, when you put your foot down, how does it
yeah,
feel? What we've seen it on the TV,
yeah.
but
I think they were prepared well enough by earlier programs, some of them robotic, like the Surveyor program, and they had a pretty good idea what the surface was going to be like. I think what scared them the most, I'm not sure fear is the right word or being scared, but I think they were worried about screwing up. They didn't want to mess
the
anything up.
pressure,
And I think
yeah,
he kind of felt like in Gemini 8 somehow, you know whether he shouldn't have believed this or not, and I don't think he should have, he kind of still feels like by putting those reentry control systems operational, that meant that they had to come down, that he kind of screwed up. He thought he maybe could think of a way that it wouldn't be a problem and they could continue and Dave could do his EVA and all that. And I think, his next flight was Apollo 11. And I think they're concerned you know, about performance and just getting it done right. I mean, and for him, of course, the key was he's got to land it. I mean, I think the movie did a good job of dramatizing. The thing had been flown before. It had been flown in the lunar environment, and had been flown in the Earth environment. So, and there was confidence that the lunar module was a good machine and could fly, but they had never tried to land it before, and they found out that there were some issues. I mean, Neil ended up flying that thing a lot differently than they thought he was going to have to, and and then the fuel issue was there. 2% ended up with 2% fuel, and that was a close call. They could have screwed up the landing, and Neil. I mean, not that Buzz didn't help. He helped, but Neil was at the controls and he took it off automatic to manual and flew that thing like it hadn't been flown in space before. And so Neil, I mean, once Neil landed, I think it was such a big relief. Worrying about stepping out on the surface was probably not much of an issue for him. I mean, once he had the damn thing down, that was what he was
yeah.
really. Because if that thing crashes, and they're either killed or marooned, and there we come into the William Sapphire statements that factor into the movie. What happens? What do we tell the nation if they get killed or they get marooned or whatever? Um, they may not try it again. I mean, you just don't know. I mean, what would have happened to the program? The Apollo fire almost killed the program, and if Gemini 8 had resulted in disaster, it could have killed the program. And if Buzz and Neil had not made it down safely, that could have killed the program. And so Neil had to land it, and it was all about the landing for him. And I in the book, I try to make a strong case that it's like he was prepared for that through his naval aviator experience. Because what's the hardest part of a naval aviation flight? Getting on the carrier, getting back from the mission, and landing on the damn carrier.
Mm.
And so he was accustomed to knowing that the very last thing he had to do in the flight was the most important. That's to get the thing down safely. So I don't think he was really too afraid of what was going to be. He was pretty sure there weren't going to be any moon men or anything to worry about, and that the surface of the moon was going to be solid enough. They were a bit surprised how they thought that the landing pods would be deeper down into the ground than they were. And since they weren't very deep, it meant that the jump from the step down to the surface was a little bit farther than they thought it was going to be. And he comments on that. But well, I thought for sure you're going to ask me about Karen's bracelet and the crater. I mean, are you going to ask about that?
No, I
What
thought
did
maybe
you
you
think
just bring it
about
up on your own.
that? Well,
Oh,
that clearly was a key to the ending of the movie, and it is a concern as to whether it's really happened or not. And I would have, I guess, at least I made the point at the time. I knew that Neil, I mean, for me, it was real interesting because since the death of the little girl was so important, as I made it out in the book to be, as I believe it was, then I knew that the issue of what they were taking with them, personal items and their PPKs, was an issue. And then Neil had never divulged what exactly he had taken. You know, we knew some of the things he had taken, but I had this hunch that he had taken from just talking to him about the little girl. I had a hunch that maybe he had taken something. And I talked to Neil's sister, and she said something like, "Oh, I dearly hope he did." You know, like it really would have been, and I wouldn't be surprised if he did. And so put that in the book as kind of a hypothetical, you know, that we don't really know for sure that if he did or if he didn't, but we don't know exactly what he did take, and it could have been. And we know that he went over to that crater, and it wasn't part of the mission plan for him to be over there, and he was over there for a while. What he actually did, we're not really sure, you know. And so, based on that, the screenwriter Josh Singer thought it would be good to have him have something occurrence that he would drop into the crater, and that would be the culmination of the drama and the heartfelt message of the movie. My suggestion was to make it somewhat like a dream sequence, where it's not necessarily literally happening, but it's imagining. It's an imagination of, because you might know that prior to that, there are flashbacks to Juniper Hills, the life in the cabin, then with the little girl and all that. I think it's beautifully done, and I thought that they could just somehow transition from that to having, you know, the idea, the imagination of Neil doing that, and not literally having doing that. And they listened to me, but I think in the end they thought, well, let's make it as real as we can make it and make it part of the story, because it could have happened. We don't know that it did, but it could have happened. And so in the end, I acquiesced and didn't make a big issue about it. And I think I will tell you, if I ever went to the moon, which is not going to happen, the first thing I would do at the Apollo 11 site is get down into the crater and look for the bracelet. I mean, I would look for something, because I think something could be in there. And if I think, I mean, this is maybe a little egocentric, but if I think after all the time I spent with him in delving into this story, and in the family life and the personal loss, you know, if that's the first thing I would do on the moon, then I think it's a legitimate piece to add to the story, because it could have happened. It should. I mean, from my point of view, it should have happened, because other astronauts, I mean, Cernan, traces the initials of his daughter Tracy in the lunarscape. Who's
Charlie Duke leaves a picture, I think, right?
Charlie Duke leaves a picture of his family. You know, so other astronauts are doing similar things. Is it so against who Neil Armstrong was to think that he could have shed a tear for his daughter that he loved so much, and leave something for her on the lunar surface? To me, if it didn't happen, it should have happened. And Neil did not tell me that it didn't happen. He just wouldn't confirm that it did. So,
I like in the film that it does, right? And I think that for any parent, regardless of whether you physically leave something there or not, my mom lost my younger sister when she was a child. You know, it's like there's a piece of you that you carry with you,
yeah.
you know, and searching for that, sense of closure. I don't know that my mom ever got that. And, it makes sense that would, and like I said, and like you said this earlier, right? When you talk about the way Gosling is trying to put his own shade
Right.
on Armstrong, you're really trying to tell a story here about this journey of this man and this inward, whether or not he placed the bracelet there or not, he certainly left a piece of her. I have to imagine.
Yeah.
On the moon.
Absolutely.
Right.
In terms of movies, again, in this genre, I think there are, my favorite space movie besides First Man is Contact, is Jodie Foster in Contact.
Dying to get that on this pod.
And I love that movie. I've watched it a million times. And what I really like about it is when she goes to Vega, or wherever it was the machine takes her, who is the alien? That's in the form of her dad. And it makes me cry first time I've seen it, it makes me cry. And then there's the other movie. What's the other movie where, I can't think of the name. I should have looked this up before time, but the other space movie that was really good. I think it's where there's some sort of being on the other side of a wall that what's the name of that movie? Uh,
Oh man.
It's
can't
definitely
think of
not
it.
Space
But
Camp.
no, it's not Space Camp. It's many people consider it one of the great space films. Um, it'll come to us when we're done. You might put it in, look,
Interstellar.
Interstellar. Interstellar. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And there is a connection there between father and daughter, I think, in that
Yeah.
film.
Absolutely.
And so there's a connection there. And I think that's important. It's an important point to make about us as humankind, that we're not doing these things. If we do these unbelievable things, they're okay. They're for science. They're for whatever else, exploration. But there's always going to be a deep human reason why we do these things. And I think the love between a father and a daughter, a father and a son, or between family members and others, husbands and wives, that somehow that's going to be a storyline in any kind of expedition journey that we take as human beings. And so the fact that these movies have focused on that, I mean, there's those three and maybe some others that do something like that. I mean, for me, it means the Apollo 11 mission, the Apollo 11 landing takes on a personal, spiritual uh, poetry that you wouldn't have otherwise. And I think it's a legitimate thing for film to do to lift the mission into an art form of sorts. So
Yeah, Jim,
I
if I
want to
can,
ask you. Go ahead.
Jason, I don't want to steal your thunder
Please.
here, but
No, please, please.
let me ask sort of a big picture question, and I know this is a little bit foreshadowing the question Jason likes to end with, but
yeah,
when they're doing this film, it's not a classic biopic, right? It's not, Neil Armstrong as a little boy, then he goes in the Navy, they show him getting shot down, whatever, that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
It doesn't go through his life. This is really more sort of a psychological profile where the
yeah.
events, the X-15, Gemini, Apollo, are kind of the background to really showing his character. Can you maybe talk about, if you're aware of, how did they arrive at, hey, that's the angle we have to take or we're going to take to tell Neil's story, rather than doing a more sort of traditional plotted out, biopic of Neil Armstrong?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty clear answer in my opinion, and that is it's the genius of Damien Chazelle. When Chazelle, when Chazelle was first approached by Universal Studios, wanted him to do a picture, and so Universal sat him down. He came to a meeting. Universal told him of the different properties they had, under their control. First Man being the book being one of them. And at first, when he first heard of it, Neil Armstrong, going the moon. I don't know if I really want to make a film about that or not. It hasn't been kind of done, and then he read the book, and I think he latched on to the chapters about the death of the child, and he was surprised by how little he knew about that personal story. And so Chazelle came to the conclusion that if I'm making a movie about Armstrong or about Apollo 11, that is what I'm going to do with it. If you want a traditional biopic, go get somebody else. And I think it was just the genius of Chazelle picking up on a storyline that makes him the director that he is, the storyteller that he is. And then he was in conversations with Ryan, because they were working to get La La Land shot, and he's already talking to him about, we want you to be. And Ryan's asking him, well, what exactly is this character? And Damien's describing to Ryan what we've just all gone through here, describing what the story would be. And Ryan said, that sounds like I would want to be part of that. I would want to be part of that story. So, then it just became, let's find a good screenwriter. And Josh Singer had just won an Academy Award for his adapted screenplay. I wrote it down, Spotlight. Remember the movie
Mhm.
Spotlight? And so Singer came on board, and Singer fell in. I mean, they had a vision of what the movie was going to be. They told Singer, "Well, this is what this is what we want." And then Josh did a brilliant job. I never saw. I mean, if every screenwriter does as much research as Josh did for this book, then I can't believe that there are many screenwriters that would do as much as he did. He did an incredible amount of research, went far beyond my book in terms of who he talked to and what he read. And so they just all joined in on a storyline that this was going to be the story we were going to tell. And then bringing me in is like, okay, that sounds pretty good to me too. I know I wanted to be careful, and I probably would have pitched a standard biopic. I wasn't smart enough to think of it in other ways. But I think in terms of what they did, it wasn't the movie people expected. That was
true.
some of the problem. People walked in there
Right.
thinking they were going to get the right stuff or Apollo 13, and then they got something, and now for something very different. Monty Python's in this line, and I think for a lot of people, they were disappointed because it wasn't. Their expectation was it was going to be one thing, and it wasn't that, and it felt like somehow we've been tricked, or somehow this isn't the right kind of film. I've had so many people tell me that after that first impression, where it wasn't what they expected, when they watched it again, no longer with that same expectation, they found it much, much more engaging than they did the first time. I think it's because that expectation was no longer there. They were more open-minded. Okay, let it flow over me. Tell me the story. But Chazelle was smart enough to know that that's what he wanted to do from the start. It took me on a ride that I didn't expect, and it took the book on a ride it didn't expect too. I think the movie, I was just going to say, I think the movie now gets more critical praise than I think it did when it first came out. I mean, it's been called. I mean, I'm hyping it a bit, but it's honestly, people are calling it a masterpiece, and some people consider it the. I mean, who's the guy that made the Dunkirk movie that just made the Oppenheimer movie? What's his name?
Christopher Nolan.
Yeah, Christopher Nolan. First Man is on his top 10 list of all-time favorite movies, and that's pretty good. That's a pretty good testimony.
You made your Interstellar,
yeah,
which is
right.
which is a film dying to heaven.
So anyway, it turned out to be quite an experience, and I'm glad it's there, and I'm proud of it, and it's there's a lot of things to say. If people are really interested in the absolute technical accuracy, historical accuracy of things, the book that Josh Singer and I did, the annotated screenplay, we cover everything. Was that simulator that spun that's in Huntsville? Did the astronauts actually use that for the Apollo missions? We cover every little detail. We made critical decisions on every little thing. We never made up a fiction that we didn't think was a good one or something that would play okay. We didn't take great liberties with the storylines. We did our absolute best to keep it as accurate in every possible way as we could. So I don't think you could have done a better job with it.
I want to ask you, Jim, and ask a part of historical contingency here. So much of this film is rooted. We were all familiar by now with the space race. This is Soviets are all over this film, whether directly or not. We're taking a lot of losses early on in the film. What happens if the Soviets make it to the moon first?
Well, have you watched For All Mankind, the streaming series on Apple TV? It's based on the whole premise of the Soviets doing the moon landing first, and I think they do a sensational job. The series so my own opinion of it is that I do believe, I'm kind of a believer in a historian's version of chaos theory, that things, one little thing that's different makes everything else different,
Mm-hmm.
and I think what I try to do as a historian is sometimes explore the what ifs. What if this? What if that? I actually wrote one essay that was published called "What if Sputnik had been first? What if the Russians had been first rather than the American Sputnik into space?" And I think all kinds of things would have been different. All kinds of things. But I believe that's why I'm excited by history, because by asking what if questions, you can sort of understand what had to come together, what things converged to make it happen the way that it did happen. I'm not saying historians should study an alternative history, although alternative histories does shed light on why things did happen the way that they did. And I'm, as a science fiction or fantasy genre, I'm attracted to alternative histories. So the Man in the High Castle, for example, that made
Hmm.
into a series. I love that. So I think, if the Russians had been first to the moon, uh, I think the United States probably would have still gone, depending upon, I think that we would have tried to go, and it might have been in some ways better, because after we did it, we went on, even on Apollo 11, the support for the Apollo program started to diminish, because, we've been there, done that, we beat them. Okay, why keep spending millions and millions and millions of dollars for it? So if the Soviets had been there first, um, maybe we would have, it would have been different, for sure, and maybe the differences would have been better in some respects, because we had Apollo programs mapped out to at least Apollo 20, but Apollo 17 ends up, the Nixon administration doesn't want to invest in something that we've already won, and they have reasons to cut back on the budget for NASA. So, I don't know. I'd have to think more about it. Although, as I said, I think For All Mankind does a pretty good job of exploring it, and they come to conclusions that a lot of really active programs, very productive programs, do result from not being first, from being second, and trying to catch up with what the Soviets had done. So,
I want to ask each of you, maybe Kevin, you chime in here. What's Armstrong's legacy now?
mm.
Is but all three of us are to varying degrees space fans. I mean, there's just it's so much of this has affected the three of us. What is Neil Armstrong? I guess maybe both to NASA and also to the world outside of NASA.
You know, by Neil having the persona that he did, that, being this sort of private individual who didn't put a lot of himself out there in a very direct way, he kind of leaves a lot of blank slate for people to fill in, right? So he
Absolutely.
can, yeah, so he can, I think, fill a lot of roles for people. They can make him kind of however they want him to be, to a degree, right? They're not going to turn him into a Buzz Aldrin. He was the big patriotic cheerleader or something. Some larger than life character. Obviously, that's not his legacy. But it's like Jim said at the outset. You can kind of see the movie, however, from whichever side you want, right? With the flag controversy, right? Oh wait, is this a leftist movie or a rightish movie? Well, you could do the same thing with Neil. He left so much of the page blank that he can be appropriated in a good positive way or a negative way by people who want to see him as an icon, as this kind of pillar, this stoic pillar of, kind of the 1960s, the space program, somebody who's going to live on in a relatively sort of unsullied heroic manner, but in this classic American archetype of the stoic, almost like Westerner kind of archetype, right? And so that's one image that you can fill in there. Yeah, the other is, well, okay, well, he was this kind of recluse who was thrust in this. He was a kind of nerdy modern test pilot type. He was a good flyer, but he really just liked his slide rules and that kind of stuff. So you could paint him in that way. There's so much room that he left for us to fill in, and obviously Jim's book, fills many pages to clarify that for the people who want to go ahead and read that. But I think, to me, that's really his legacy, is that he's this figure that there's enough ambiguity there, but positive ambiguity, that he'll be seen as this icon of that period, that he well filled that role of first man on the moon, who's going to be remembered for generations, for centuries or whatever, for having done that without, like, those kind of weird questions about him if it had been somebody else.
Well, I'm going to sort of, maybe, I'm not sure that this is a good legacy, but I have a feeling that could be a legacy. And that is, with evolving technology and AI and robotics and other related fields, I see Armstrong becoming a three-dimensional, I mean, this is probably the wrong words to use, but like a three-dimensional avatar, where we create a virtual Neil Armstrong. Similar, there's a project that's been finished, I guess, to that involves the Shoah Foundation and Holocaust survivors, where they did lengthy interviews of hours and hours and hours of tape recording video and audio with sophisticated cameras and microphones and stuff. And I've seen this in action out in Los Angeles, where you could have a survivor, say, of Auschwitz, and he's sitting on a stage on a chair, and he looks like he's actually there. And he can be on your computer. It can be at an exhibit. It can be at an exhibit in a museum. It can be on a stage. It can be anywhere. And you can ask him any question, and there's enough record, enough data that and with the proper logarithms and language recognition programming and stuff, that you can ask him, well, how did you end up in Auschwitz? And this entity will answer the questions, and you can keep talking to him. And if you ask him some ridiculous question there's no answer to, this programming will say, well, please ask me another question. I don't have an answer for that one. I see Neil Armstrong becoming one of those three-dimensional avatars where he can be asked. I mean, it'd be kind of a rude thing to do to Neil, given what a private life.
Right. He'd be horrified.
Never available. He was never available to anyone. Now he's going to be available to everyone at all times.
Everybody.
Data. You can ask him anything you want. He's going to have to come up with an answer. And actually, there's been some movement afoot to do exactly that. I mean, his persona is actually, it's proprietary now. And I don't know how the legal judgment would be about this if it was challenged. But Purdue University now has ownership of his persona. So if you wanted to do something like that, you'd have to have Purdue's permission. That's the way I understand it. But maybe at some point Purdue, I mean, they've already digitized all my recordings with him. Say you take all of the other things that Neil's ever said and any video and any audio you have of him, you get people that know what they're doing to digitize all that stuff, put it all together in a proper program, and you can have a Neil Armstrong that's going to be into the future talking to us and answering any question we have about him. And I think, there's a theater in London, I think, the Swedish rock group ABBA. They've done this for ABBA. You can have the ABBA group of the 1960s or 1970s perform a whole concert, and you think they're there, as they look back in, when they were 20 or 30 years old. And it's like a phenomenal performance. I've had people tell me about it. Well, who wouldn't want it? What kind of educational purposes could you use for Neil Armstrong answering questions of first graders, sixth graders, college students, anybody? So I would not at all be surprised that at some point Neil becomes this forever person that can talk to us, and it's going to be as close to his own voice and his own body, his own face, his own thinking, his own expressions. I think technologically it's possible. It's getting real close to being possible already, and the Shoah Foundation proves it. The ABBA performance proves it. I think there's other things like that going on. So how that would change people's thoughts about Neil if they have him talking to them all the time and answering all their questions, I mean, that would change things too. So I've thought about that before, and I'm not sure I liked it. I'm not promoting it as an idea. Might be leave him alone, just let him stay where he's at in the history books. But I don't think we're gonna. I think there'd be a museum. Dayton would love to have him. I'm sure Dayton would love to have him.
That's true.
On stage somehow in the Wright Pat Museum. Yeah.
All right, guys. Let me ask you maybe our final question tonight, and maybe the most obvious one tonight. Kevin was alluding to this earlier. Is First Man a history movie?
Kevin,
you want me to go first? Yeah. So
sir.
The reason I'd asked you that question a few minutes ago was because I was thinking about this question. And, I mean, some are really obviously history movies, right? I think the movie that they ended up doing is more a historical movie than a history movie, right? You're not going to, if you know nothing about the space program, nothing about Neil Armstrong, you're not going to put on that movie and then have a understanding of the history of the space program. You're going to get an idea. Okay, well, you might figure out what he's flying at the beginning. And I've actually gotten this feedback from people who aren't interested in space stuff, who've watched that, like, what was going on in those first 10 minutes? What was he flying? Is he coming back from the moon? So I think as you watch that, you're not really getting a sense of the history. It's kind of what I was saying before. It's more the setting to be this sort of personality study, this sort of psychological examination of this iconic character. So in that sense, it's not a movie that's, telling a particular history, or at least a history of the space program or a particular event. It's a personal history of Neil Armstrong. It's not a space program history, but even that, like I said, picking up in 1961, I think is the first date there, going up through 1969. I mean, that's an 8-year swath. So what, 1/10 of his life. So there's, that's not a very very big slice to look at. So to me, it's
Yeah.
not a history movie like you're going to go and understand, okay, here's how D-Day happened, or here's World War One, something like that. So it's historical in that it's looking at a historical figure in a particular setting, telling you a bit about this person, but it's not a history movie like you're going to understand, from A to Z what the space program was about.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that, Kevin. What would you say is a history movie in space? Would you say Apollo 13 is a history movie or not?
Yeah, so I think Apollo 13, obviously you're talking about a much even shorter time frame, right? But the plot there is this particular event. So, that is a historical episode. It's like, I guess you could say like Band of Brothers is a, or not Band of Brothers, Saving Private Ryan is a history movie, right? They're telling about this slice of events, even though it's fictional aside from D-Day. But, Apollo 13 is talking about a historical event. You plug into that at the beginning, you come out at the end, you understand the arc of that, the history of that event. The When we did this podcast, a couple of months ago on The Right Stuff, this is a little bit of a complicated question because, yeah, it's a history movie, but it's bad history, right? Good movie, terrible history. So does that mean it counts as a history movie? I'm not so sure. So I think First Man fits in that sort of gray area in a different way. It's like I said, it's not telling the history of a particular event. I don't think you're going to get that depth of understanding of those events, but you'll get insight into Neil Armstrong as a man, and I think that seems to be what the thrust of the movie was about. Of course, your book, fantastic history, right? Get it right here.
Can a history movie have a major fictionalization as part of it? For example, in Apollo 13, the whole notion of failure is not an option, which Gene Kranz is played by Ed Harris, is a central element of the movie. He never said it in
Right.
real life. It comes from somewhere else, and so that's a major fictionalization. It works really well with the movie. Um, so I guess I'm not sure I would necessarily accept the challenge myself. I think it can still be a history movie with a major fictionalization like that, as long as the essence of the truth is there through it all. But if I were again, if you were asking someone to watch to learn about the Apollo program or even about Apollo 13, I'd probably go to a documentary rather than to a history movie, unless you want to call a documentary a history movie. Uh, anyway, fascinating. Thanks, guys, for asking me to come. You do what you're doing
Guys,
is
no.
a great thing. I've watched some of your others. I watched the one on Gettysburg. I thought that was a very controversial uh, treatment of the subject and of the movie itself. So thank you very much for asking me to come. I really enjoyed it, and I hope people do not stay away from the movie at this point. First Man, I think I have grandchildren that are two grandsons that are 9, and they've just watched it for the first time, and I wasn't. I think it's really too early for them to really enjoy it, and we had to put their hands over their ears. And Janet got real upset with Neil at the end of the film, but anyway,
Yeah,
No.
I would say it definitely hits differently on multiple viewings. Once, as somebody who's obviously in that field, you're looking at it with a different sort of critical eye than somebody who's knows something about the space program but isn't necessarily expert or an enthusiast in some way. So I think once you get over that sort of initial shock of the approach of it, right? Once you realize it's not meeting your expectations, like, hey, I'm gonna get, Neil Armstrong biopic, then when you watch it
Right.
again, I think you're able to kind of step back and appreciate what they are doing there. And I think so. I rewatched it over the weekend, I think for fourth, maybe fifth time. And, even then it's like, okay, I really appreciate what they're doing here to a greater degree, even than the second or third time I saw it. So I think it's a great movie from that sense. So any of our listeners or viewers who are considering it, I'd say go back and rewatch it with an open mind, and appreciate it for what it is. And this was great advice I got in grad school for doing book reviews. Don't review
Oh yeah.
the book that they didn't write,
Totally.
review the book that they did. And so take the same approach to the movie.
Well,
Yeah.
the thing I'm excited about is that this podcast is going to come out 3 days before we actually watch the film on the watch party that we do every Sunday
Oh,
night. So this film will come out this podcast will get released on a Thursday, and then we're going to all watch this together. And I'm hoping that the audience will get a chance to listen. Jim, this has been a brilliant. Like, I'm sitting here listening to, and I have sat back. I've done over 100 of these now, and I truly love, like, everybody comes on, takes time to come and share their stories. But this has been such a treat to be, first of all, to meet you and be able to say hey, and then to also listen to just not only your thoughts on the film, but your craft of history, the historian's work, what this stuff means, both on a larger level, but on a personal level too. So, guys, this has been amazing. I'm totally begging you both to come back later on when we do Interstellar or Contact or Event Horizon or Tin Cup, Jim, whatever. So I knew I'd get you eventually. So, guys, we can get into it. Guys, thank you so much for being here. This has been amazing. Hey, guys, that was so much fun talking to Jim and Kevin tonight, talking to you about First Man, Neil Armstrong, his life, his legacy, and all of the things surrounding the Apollo missions. Guys, if you want to keep HATM going, you want to keep this ship flying, if you will, go to patreon.com/historians of the movies. Like and subscribe here on YouTube. $7 a month helps us pay the bills around here, helps keep things going over here. So if you will, patreon.com/historians of the movies. Go over here, hit us up. But share this podcast with all your friends, neighbors, and some of your enemies. We got a whole lot more pods coming to you in the next few weeks, so I hope you'll enjoy them. For now, though, we'll catch you next time.